Augustus. Augustus died the way almost no Roman emperor after him would, in bed, old and more or less on his own terms. He passed away on August 19th, 14 AD, in Nola, a small town in Campania, at the remarkable age of 75, having ruled the Roman world for over 4 decades. His final hours were spent with his wife Livia, and according to Suetonius, his last words to her were a kiss and the line, "Live mindful of our wedlock, Livia, and farewell." Other accounts give him a more theatrical exit, asking friends gathered at his bedside whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and if so, to send him off with applause. It was the kind of death a man plans for, which made it almost unique in the history of the empire he had created. Almost, because ancient sources record a persistent rumor that Livia had poisoned figs from the garden tree that Augustus regularly ate from, fearing he was reconsidering his succession plans and might sideline her son Tiberius at the last moment. The rumor has never been proven, but it lodged itself in the historical imagination for a reason. In Rome, a peaceful death always raised the question of whether it really was. Tiberius died at 77 on March 16, 37 AD, at a villa near Misenum on the Bay of Naples, and the circumstances were almost certainly not as peaceful as the official account suggested. He had spent the last 11 years of his reign on the island of Capri, growing increasingly paranoid and reclusive. According to both Tacitus and Suetonius, Tiberius appeared to be recovering from a serious illness when he suddenly lost consciousness, and the entire court, believing he was dead, began congratulating Caligula on his accession. Then Tiberius woke up and asked for food. The panic that followed was immediate and practical. Macro, according to Suetonius, ordered the old emperor smothered with his bedclothes. Whether the smothering actually happened or whether Tiberius simply died minutes later anyway is impossible to know with certainty. But the scene captures something true about his reign. He was surrounded by people who had been waiting years for exactly this moment, and none of them were inclined to wait any longer. Caligula. Caligula was 28 years old and had been emperor for less than 4 years when he was stabbed 30 times in a palace corridor on January 24, 41 AD. The assassination was organized by a group of Praetorian officers, led by a tribune named Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had made a habit of publicly humiliating, mocking his voice, giving him degrading watchwords, forcing him to kiss his hand in suggestive poses. The attack happened during the Palatine Games, in a narrow underground passage connecting the palace to the theater, and it was fast and brutal. Caligula took the first blow to the shoulder and reportedly screamed that he was still alive, which only prompted the remaining conspirators to stab him again and again until he wasn't. His wife Caesonia was killed immediately afterward. Their infant daughter, according to Suetonius, was killed by having her head smashed against a wall. The Praetorian Guard found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor before the Senate had time to discuss alternatives. Claudius died on October 13, 54 AD, at the age of 63, and the mushrooms that killed him have been suspicious ever since. The ancient sources are in broad agreement that his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, arranged the poisoning to secure the succession for her son Nero before Claudius could change his mind and favor his biological son Britannicus instead. The method was a dish of poisoned mushrooms served at a banquet, though Claudius's notoriously irregular digestive system apparently complicated matters. He may have vomited up some of the poison. Tacitus adds a grimly practical detail. The physician Xenophon, who was in on the plot, administered a second dose by inserting a poisoned feather down Claudius's throat, under the guise of helping him purge. Nero later described mushrooms as the food of the gods, since it was by mushrooms that Claudius had become a god. Agrippina kept Claudius's death secret for several hours while she staged the transition of power, pretending he was still alive and resting, until everything was in place, and Nero could be presented to the Praetorian Guard. Nero was 30 years old when he died in a ditch outside Rome on June 9, 68 AD, after failing repeatedly to kill himself. His last year had been defined by military revolts across the empire, and when the Senate finally declared him a public enemy, his Praetorian Guard abandoned him, and the people of Rome did not come to his defense. He fled the city at night with a handful of freedmen, ended up hiding in a villa about 4 miles outside Rome belonging to a man named Phaon, and spent his final hours in a state of paralyzed indecision, alternating between rehearsing dramatic speeches, digging a shallow grave, and begging his companions to demonstrate how to die. When the sound of approaching hoofbeats confirmed soldiers were coming to arrest him, he finally drove a dagger into his throat with the help of his secretary Epaphroditus. His reported final words were, "What an artist dies in me," a line either heartbreaking or absurd depending on your patience for Nero, which after 30 years most Romans had exhausted entirely. Otho reigned for 95 days and ended his life with considerably more dignity than he had lived it. After his forces were crushed at the First Battle of Bedricum on April 14, 69 AD, Otho refused to continue the war. He was 36 years old, and he had allies who urged him to fight on. He rejected all of it. According to Plutarch, Otho said it was better to die once for so many men than to have so many men die for one person, and then he spent his final evening calmly settling his affairs, distributing money to his servants, and sleeping soundly. In the morning, he drank a glass of cold water, picked up one of 2 daggers he had hidden under his pillow, and stabbed himself through the heart the moment he woke up. The single blow was immediately fatal. Suetonius, who found most emperors contemptible, called it a death unworthy of his life, meaning the death was too good for the man. His soldiers were so moved that several of them killed themselves at his funeral pyre. Vitellius had been emperor for 8 months when Vespasian's forces entered Rome in late December 69 AD, and his final hours were a sustained exercise in humiliation. He was discovered in a doorkeeper's room with a dog and a mattress pushed against the door, and dragged out anyway. Soldiers tied his hands behind his back, looped a noose around his neck to keep his head forced upward so the crowd could spit in his face, and marched him through the streets of Rome to the Gemonian stairs. He was stabbed repeatedly with small cuts along the way, not deep enough to kill, just enough to keep him suffering and conscious. His reported final words to a soldier taunting him were simply, "And yet I was your emperor," a statement that was true, briefly, and apparently meant nothing to anyone by the time he said it. He was executed at the stairs and his body thrown into the Tiber. He was 54 years old. Domitian was 44 years old and had spent his final years as emperor in increasingly open paranoia when a palace conspiracy finally caught up with him on September 18, 96 AD. The plot included his chamberlain Parthenius, a senior freedman named Stephanus, who had been walking around the palace for days with his arm in a fake sling concealing a dagger, and the Praetorian prefects. An astrologer had reportedly warned Domitian of the exact hour of his death, and he spent that day distracted and anxious, checking the time repeatedly. When Stephanus struck the first blow, Domitian grabbed at the blade with his bare hands, screaming for a slave to bring the dagger he kept hidden under his pillow. The pillow had been removed by his chamberlain earlier that morning. He was stabbed 7 times in total and died on the floor of his bedroom. The Senate's reaction upon hearing the news was to immediately vote to erase his name from all public inscriptions. Hadrian's death on July 10, 138 AD, in the resort town of Baiae on the Bay of Naples, was one of the most drawn-out and miserable endings in the imperial record. He was 62 years old and had spent at least the last 2 years of his life suffering from what appears to have been severe congestive heart failure, his body swelling with fluid, his legs and feet grotesquely edematous. He reportedly begged multiple people to kill him, and was refused each time, including his doctor, who subsequently killed himself to avoid being ordered again. Hadrian tried to stab himself and was stopped. He tried to obtain poison and was refused. He finally died naturally in his own time, hated by the Senate. He left behind the wall in Britain bearing his name, the Pantheon in its current form, and a short poem addressed to his own departing soul, little soul, wandering, gentle thing, that remains one of antiquity's most quietly devastating pieces of writing. Commodus had spent years believing he was the reincarnation of Hercules, renaming Rome after himself, and fighting in the gladiatorial arena against opponents who were carefully arranged not to injure him. He was 31 years old when his own household decided they had had enough. The conspirators had discovered a wax tablet in Commodus's bedroom, listing the names of people he planned to have executed, and their names were on it. They poisoned his food at dinner on December 31st, 192 AD, but Commodus vomited most of it up. Running out of time, they sent his wrestling partner, a man named Narcissus, into the bedroom and had him strangle Commodus in his bath. He was found dead the following morning. The Senate's reaction was to immediately pass a formal motion declaring him an enemy of the state. Pertinax lasted 87 days. He was 66 years old, a former slave's son who had risen through the military to the very top, and he made the fatal mistake of trying to impose discipline on the Praetorian Guard that had just made him emperor. He cut their bonuses and enforced regulations they had ignored for years. On March 28, 193 AD, roughly 300 of them stormed the Palatine Palace. Pertinax walked out to meet them. According to Cassius Dio, His speech actually worked for a moment. He stood in front of them and addressed them calmly, and several soldiers began to waver. Then one man threw a spear. Pertinax covered his face with his robe in the Roman manner of accepting death with dignity, and was cut down where he stood. The Praetorian Guard then auctioned the emperorship to the highest bidder. The winning bid came from a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who paid an enormous sum per soldier and lasted 66 days before the Senate condemned him and sent a single soldier to carry out his execution in an empty palace. His reported last words were, "But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" Caracalla. Caracalla was assassinated on April 8, 217 AD, in the most undignified circumstances imaginable. He was urinating by the side of a road. The imperial party was traveling from Edessa toward the temple of the moon god at Carrhae, and Caracalla had dismounted to relieve himself, attended by a single bodyguard. A soldier named Julius Martialis, who had a personal grudge against Caracalla for refusing to promote his brother, walked up behind him and stabbed him once through the back. The wound was fatal. Caracalla was 29 years old. Praetorian prefect Macrinus, who had organized the entire assassination, stood at a careful distance watching. 6 years earlier, Caracalla had murdered his own brother Geta in their mother Julia Domna's apartments, soldiers bursting in during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting. Geta had fled to his mother, wrapping his arms around her, and was stabbed to death while she held him. She was wounded in the hands trying to shield him and covered in his blood. Caracalla's name lives on. His brother's name was erased from every inscription, monument, coin, and official document across the empire, a process that required chisels working on stone all the way from Britain to Syria. Elagabalus. Elagabalus was 17 or 18 years old when the Praetorian Guard murdered him on March 11, 222 AD, dragged him through Rome, and threw his body in the Tiber. His reign of nearly 4 years had been characterized by the promotion of a Syrian sun cult, a series of marriages including to a Vestal virgin, and a general disregard for Roman religious and social norms that had made the Senate, the army, and eventually his own grandmother furious. The guard had become attached to his more stable cousin, Alexander Severus, whom Elagabalus had tried to have killed. When the attempt failed, the guard turned on him instead. His mother Julia Soaemias was killed alongside him. He was a teenager who had been handed the Roman Empire and had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Valerian. Valerian's death is unlike any other emperors on this list because it is the only one that involved being captured alive by a foreign enemy. In 260 AD, during a campaign against the Persian Sassanid Empire, Valerian was seized by the Persian king Shapur I at or after the Battle of Edessa. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner, possibly used as a human footstool by Shapur when mounting horses, according to some accounts, though the exact manner of his treatment and death in captivity is unknown. He died sometime between 260 and 264 AD, age approximately 70. Shapur had his skin stuffed after death and displayed in a Persian temple as a permanent trophy. For the Roman Empire, the capture of a sitting emperor by a foreign king was an unprecedented catastrophe. Aurelian. Aurelian had spent 5 years reuniting the fragmented empire and was killed in September 275 AD near Byzantium on his way to campaign against Persia, the victim of a forged document. His secretary Eros had made an error and feared punishment, so he forged a list of names purporting to be men Aurelian intended to execute, and distributed it to the officers named. They killed Aurelian preemptively. The entire conspiracy was based on a lie told by a panicking clerk. When the truth emerged afterward, the army was reportedly so disgusted that they refused to choose a new emperor and instead sent word to the Senate to make the selection. Aurelian had called himself restorer of the world on his coins, and it was not an empty claim. He was killed because a secretary made an administrative mistake and was too frightened to admit it. Diocletian. Diocletian did something almost no emperor managed. He voluntarily retired. In 305 AD, he abdicated, moved to his enormous palace on the Adriatic coast in what is now Split, Croatia, and grew cabbages. When colleagues urged him to return to power during a succession crisis, he reportedly asked them if they could see how fine his cabbages were and declined. He died in late 311 or early 312 AD at approximately 68 years old, possibly of illness, possibly of deliberate self-starvation in the Stoic manner, and possibly of grief after the political arrangements he had carefully constructed collapsed into civil war in his final years. His death was so quiet and private, after decades of absolute power, that the historical record barely notes when it happened. Julian. Julian was 31 years old and had been emperor for less than 2 years when he died on June 26, 363 AD, from a spear wound suffered during a skirmish on the retreat from his failed Persian campaign. He was the last non-Christian emperor, had spent his reign attempting to roll back Constantine's religious policies and restore traditional Roman religion, and died in circumstances that immediately became the subject of competing claims. His own soldiers maintained the spear came from a Persian cavalryman. A persistent counter-tradition, mentioned by ancient Christian writers, claimed the weapon was thrown by a soldier in his own army, a Christian who saw an opportunity. Julian reportedly spent his final hours in philosophical conversation with friends, discussing the nature of the soul, and died before dawn. His religious restoration died with him, essentially within the same campaign season. Valens. Valens died on August 9, 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, in what became the most catastrophic Roman military defeat since Cannae 7 centuries earlier. The Gothic army that had been allowed to settle inside Roman borders the previous year, and then exploited and mistreated by corrupt Roman officials, turned on the empire. Valens led his army into battle without waiting for reinforcements from his western co-emperor Gratian. The Roman army was encircled and destroyed. Two-thirds of the Eastern Field Army, approximately 20,000 men, died in a few hours. Valens himself was wounded and carried from the field, and died either in the fighting or shortly after in a farmhouse. One account says the farmhouse was set on fire by Goths, who didn't know the emperor was inside. His body was never recovered. He was approximately 50 years old, and his death at Adrianople marks, for many historians, the beginning of the empire's terminal decline in the west. Romulus Augustulus. Romulus Augustulus was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, and fittingly he didn't die, he was simply told to leave. On September 4, 476 AD, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the teenage Romulus, sent him into comfortable exile at the Castellum Lucullianum on the Bay of Naples, and pensioned him off with an allowance. He was probably 14 or 15 years old. His father Orestes, who had actually held the real power, was executed. Romulus was spared, possibly because of his youth, possibly because Odoacer found him harmless, possibly because killing a teenage boy named after the founder of Rome and the first emperor of Rome simultaneously felt like it carried some kind of bad luck. The date of his actual death is unknown. He may have lived as late as 500 AD in exile, the last ghost of the Western Empire, growing old in a converted villa overlooking a bay, while the world he was supposed to have inherited reorganized itself entirely around him. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.